Hello, in today's video I'm going to show you a few of the custom grinds that I offered through Toronto Pen Company. First I'm going to show you an architect grind that is a fairly popular grind and one that I get a lot of questions and comments about. This is an extra fine Montblanc nib, which is, as you know, German pens go, they're not really as fine as the Japanese or in general Asian fine pens. So it wasn't as fine as I wanted, and I had the option of changing it to an extra fine or doing something interesting like doing an architect grind on it, and I went with an architect grind. Now the advantage of an architect grind is that you can always turn it into a fine nib if you don't really like it. But in essence, an architect grind is an italic nib that's turned 90 degrees. So an italic pen an italic nib would give you a thin horizontal, whereas an architect grind gives you a thick horizontal and a thin vertical as opposed to the italic grind. This gives you kind of an interesting variation on the typical italic nibs, and can be quite interesting. Now italic grinds, just like architect grinds, just like italic grinds, can be either sharp or stubbish. I prefer them slightly on the stubbish side because just by the nature of them, they are a little bit less smooth than a comparable italic grind, and there's essentially a technical reason for it, but we won't go into that right now. One of the variations that I quite like on an architect grind is that I offer a combination grind, which is an architect grind when the nib is held in the right side up position, but if you reverse it, it will write in a fine or a medium line. This pen is ground to be more of a fine line, and I kind of quite like the effect of it. This I can play with this nib for a while, as you can tell. This is a Bexley nib that I've just ground for a friend. Now on the italics side, the general discussion is on the sharpness of the grind. An italic grind, by the definition, I'm going to show you a kind of an extreme example of it. This is an italic nib. As you can see, it's very broad, and what it does is that it will produce a thin line going horizontally and a thick line going vertically. Now of course this nib does not have any tipping. It has been cut off, and I use it for my calligraphy practice and working out compositions and stuff. But the same principle can be applied to finer nibs. For example, this is an FPR nib in a dollar pen from Pakistan. This is one of my tester pens. So again, as you see, it's a thin horizontal and a thicker vertical. What is the difference between an italic, cursive, italic, and a stub? And the difference essentially is the degree of sharpness. The degree of sharpness does not mean the difference between the horizontals and the verticals, but the sharpness of the transitions. On an italic nib, this transition would be sharp, whereas on a cursive nib, it would be a slightly softer transition, whereas on a stub, it will be the least of compared to the two. The biggest difference you will feel is in the writing experience. So an italic nib would be a bit less forgiving in terms of the angle to the paper. For example, if you apply the side of the nib to the paper, it won't write unless it's touching the whole width of the nib, or close to the whole width of the nib is touching the paper, whereas on a stub it would be a bit more forgiving. So this is a cursive italic grind, not very sharp, not too stubbish either. So it gives us good line variation without being very demanding in terms of the nib angle and that sort of thing. A stub, if I can find it, yes. This is more of a stub, and as you can see, the horizontals are just as thin, the vertical is just as thick, but the transition would not be as sharp as, well, actually on this paper and this ink it comes out pretty sharp, but the feel of it, you can tell that it's not as you see, the nib at different angles is still forgiving and puts down a line, whereas the other one wasn't. So a stub is generally, now the stubs also, that it could be very rounded. I tend to keep them a bit on the sharper side of the spectrum. Now generally for italic writing or italic type scripts, you want an X height of at least 4 or 5 nib widths, and that is generally a bit too large for a nib that's ground to produce a thick line of more than 0.5 millimeter. So a fine italic grind is actually in my opinion more usable. So this is a fine nib on this Jinhao something or the other, and it's and I just ground it to be a fine cursive italic, and you can see that the verticals are much thinner than the FPR nib. That was, I think, started as a 1 mm nib, but ends up being about like maybe 0.8, 0.9. This is about 0.5 mm. So this produces kind of a nice line variation and is still very usable in everyday writing at speed. Pretty smooth, works well, and this is I think a grind that a lot of people could probably get more use out of. Some of the other things I do, I like fine nibs for my letter writing. So this is a Schaefer no nonsense of the old style, and it had a medium nib that I really didn't have any use for, so it's ground to an extra fine nib, which is not inked right now. Let me see if I can dip it. Okay, so has a bit too much ink right now, but you get the idea. So the extra fine, now any grind, any of these grinds that we discuss, there's not just the shape of the tipping or the shape of the nib itself, but also the ink flow. It contributes to the performance of a nib to a large degree. So any grind is not simply reshaping the tipping, it also includes adjusting the flow so it will produce the whatever the performance is desired consistently. So this is another extra fine grind. Now this is on a Lamy one of my favorite colors. This is the 2011 lime green, I think the original edition. So these nibs aren't as fine, even though it says EF, it actually wasn't. So I ground it to an extra fine nib, and I just love how it came out smooth, well, relatively smooth, because as you go finer and finer, you're going to end up feeling more of the texture of the paper. So there's just no way getting around that. So a fine nib will not be as smooth as a medium or a broader nib. It will be close, it won't catch, but it won't be rough, but it will have a little bit more feedback to it. So I hope this was useful in terms of what different grinds and nibs do. If you have any questions, please do comment, and I'll try my best to get back to you as quickly as possible. Thank you very much for watching, and look forward to talking to you soon. Bye bye.